Yeah, okay, so welcome everyone. I wanted to give a bit of an overview of Godot and also show the project that I'm working on, Rift Riff. It's a tower defense game. I'm not gonna dive too deep into it, but it's good to know, just to give you a bit of context. Tower defense game where resources come throughout the waves, a bunch of enemies. They pop up and you got to shoot them. I mean, we all know what tower defense is. It's basically one of the oldest genres in games. So currently making this game with a small team of 4 people. And yeah, that's the project that I will be showing a little bit of today. But I mostly will be using this project as a way to show you what the Godot editor is capable of. I had to make the editor really small, so things will be a little bit cramped so that the quality and the zoom level is good enough for you to see right now. So yeah, let's go ahead and check out what's here in the view. So let's go from left to right. Here in the left top there is the scene view, something that, if you're familiar to Unity, would be the hierarchy. It's a tree of objects. Then just below that, there's the file system, which is like the assets. Then in the middle, there's the scene view, as it would be called in Unity, but here it's called the 2D view. There would also be a 3D view if I had not literally disabled it for this project. This view here, that's now the 2D view, can also be changed to be a script view or the asset library view. But generally speaking, I have the script view in another window, a pop-up window, because I have a large screen. So that's possible. And then here at the bottom, there's currently an output panel that can also go to different tabs, such as the debugger, which has a bunch of profiling, stack trace, error stuff, some fancy audio stuff, an animation editor, and a shader editor. And then on the right, there's the inspector, as you might know. It's very similar to what you would have in other engines. You are inspecting the object that you have selected. Then there's one more tab that's relatively important, something that I think I'll cover later, which is the node tab, which houses a bunch of signals. Signals is essentially the thing in Godot that is based like how do you say it? I think it's called a event bus in C#. Signals are the things that you can use to connect objects and have function calls over different objects. So yeah, that's very quickly the editor and the windows that are generally there. Again, you can customize this, and there's a bunch of more windows that I'm not covering, but that's the basics. If you want to play the game, you hit the play button, and it almost instantly just runs the game. So that's, I think, the basics of the Godot engine, all the elements it has. So now let's dive a little bit deeper into each component, right? So in Godot, the thing that are essentially the building blocks of any game is what Godot calls nodes. So in the scene tree here at the left top, you have a bunch of objects. These are all nodes. You have different kinds of nodes. If we go look at all the kinds of different nodes that are there, you can see at the very top there's the node, which is essentially like the base type. Of course, the node can be derived by custom scripts, but there's a lot of already built-in types of nodes. The two that I'm using most in Rift Riff is the control node and the node 2D. Node 2D is essentially the thing that, you know, if you have a spatial scene, a world scene, a level, whatever, then the node the node 2D is the one that you'll use. And then there's control nodes that you use for UI stuff. So the thing with nodes is, because everything derives from nodes, they are very, very cheap. You can have 100,000 nodes, and the impact of it being so many objects and so many nodes is very minimalistic. So if you compare it to, say, an engine like Unity, where you have a game object and you have components to it, the way that you could look at this node system is that in Godot, you don't necessarily have components. You just have another node as a child. That's the way you can look at this. And then there's various ways to connect them and various ways to reference the nodes among themselves. So you can still have that sort of component-based structure, but it's not a necessity. So yeah, without diving into all the different kinds of nodes that you can already see in here, because there are many of them. That's not something I will do too much today, but I do wanted to mention that nodes, once you want to save a bunch of nodes, for instance, a whole level, what it goes into is a packed scene. And this is a nice transition to the file system, because a packed scene is essentially a scene of nodes, and a packed scene is something that you could consider to be a prefab in Unity, right? In Unity, you have these prefabs with a bunch of game objects. There's a bit of an overlap there. At the same time, in Godot, it doesn't really differentiate between scenes and prefabs. It's just all the same thing, packed scenes. So here, currently, what we have opened is this level 2 thing, and that is a text scene, a packed scene. But so is the player, so are enemies, so are all the entities. Everything is packed scenes, just collection of nodes. So if we are looking here in the scene tree, there's this little icon over here. We can click on it and it will open up another scene. And then there's another thing over here, a sound container. We can open that up and then there's another scene, etc., etc. So you can have as many scenes as you want, going layers, thousands of layers deep. Scene inside scene inside scene. That's just something that's the way that Godot works here. So the thing with the packed scene is that it is a resource. So just now we talked about nodes being sort of the backbone of the game objects in the game. Resources are the backbones of all the assets in the game. Among them packed scenes, but also textures, fonts, perhaps some what you in Unity would call scriptable objects, but in this case are just custom resources. So a lot of things, yeah, resources are very easy to customize yourself and to create yourself. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know what else to say about files. We all know how assets work. You can import them. There's import settings for a lot of the base types. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about scripts. Of course, script is a big subject. As you might know, Godot supports essentially two main languages. The first one is GDScript. This is a language specifically developed by the Godot contributors. That is a language that looks a lot like Python. And the other one is C#. If you're a long-time Unity user, you might be inclined to start immediately downloading the C# version of Godot and then immediately dive into Godot. But I do want to talk a little bit about scripts and scripting in GDScript, because there's a bunch of pros and cons to GDScript compared to C#. And I'll just share a couple of the things that I've stumbled upon, but there's probably thousands more. So I think one of the nicest things about GDScript, something I never knew I missed when I was working in Unity for 12 years, is the fact that GDScript doesn't compile. It's parsed and it essentially compiles instantly. So anytime I hit the play button, I can just play the game. And on top of that, what's very cool is that it also hot reloads. So say I'm walking around with the character as I am now. I'm going to change a simple variable here, in this case even a constant, which is funny, but now I'm running around very quickly. This hot reloading, it doesn't just happen with constants, it also happens with when you add entire functions or replace entire functions. So the hot reloading is very effective and it works really well. And I often use this feature to tweak things, and even as I'm writing code, adding more functionality to it, replacing entire functions. So those are two very nice things of C#, or of GDScript. And of course, the syntax is a little funny compared to C#. It lacks a couple things that C# has, like interfaces, although they are making something called traits, which is basically the same thing. Naming convention is a little funny. And there's this thing where you don't, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the term duck typing. I wasn't before I started Godot, but the word duck typing means that you don't, in a language that supports duck typing, you don't have to define what type of variable it is. So that means that your code becomes really confusing, in my opinion. But it's very beginner friendly in that sense. However, it was something that I didn't like, and so the first thing I did when I started working with GDScript was to enable something called static typing. So it forces me to add the type of everything that's in there, from variables to constants, but also functions, whether it's a void or whatever else. So yeah, that's very short on scripting. There's a lot more to be said. There's a lot of features in GDScript that I would say it is almost on par with C#. But if you use GDScript, you will not be able to, for instance, utilize stuff like NuGet packages, which is huge for the C# community. So yeah, that a little bit about scripting. There's a funny thing with scripting, like usually the scripts extend a node. And what that means is that the scripts themselves, it's not something you apply on top of the node. No, the script itself is basically the node. So it inherits all the properties of the nodes itself. So that works a little slightly different than how Unity would do it. Anything else I want to say about scripts? Yes. So just like in Unity, in the inspector, you can decide what things that you want to put in the inspector. There's this thing called an export variable. If you use this annotation, that thing will end up in the inspector. And you can reference anything here. Anything you reference in here becomes a dependency of the script. So it will also be loaded when you load this node or the script. And what I wanted to say a little something about this node tab that I was talking about earlier. So let's actually go to enemy shooter. The enemy shooter has a weapon node attached to it, which is also a script, fairly long script, but it has this thing called a signal. So signals are the sort of event bus system that is sort of integrated into Godot, and a lot of the core objects and the core features, the built-in features in Godot also use signals for you to get a signal, like a function call, the moment something happens. And you can also customize these. So if we're going for this weapon thing that's part of the enemy, go to the node tab, we can see that the signal that I scripted here is also here. And I can attach this signal to, in this case, the parent, which is the enemy itself. So this means that whenever in this script I call initiate attack, actually it forwards this attack also to somewhere inside the enemy node in this particular case. But this also goes for all the built-in stuff. So for instance, there's this weapon is actually, it derives from, let's actually see, it derives from this built-in class called area2d, which is a physics object that has triggers when a body enters or exits it. And those are also used as signals. So what you do is you connect a signal to those events to your own script. And then you can use those. So in that sense, signals are very core to what Godot offers, and you can customize them as well. So that's a little bit about the scripting part. Because we don't have super much time, maybe you guys, if you have more questions about this, I'm very happy to answer them, but please write them in the chat. Yeah, I'm going to move on because I have a lot of things to show you. I can show you right now already the animator. Let's actually go to the player. So there's the built-in animator here. I have an animation player here. I can play these animations. And this animator is actually, it's really good. I was actually quite surprised by how good it is. You can add tracks, different kinds of tracks, also calling method tracks, blending tracks, audio tracks, all sorts of things. And this is just the animation itself. You can also have systems, how do you call that? State machine animation trees that then use these animators depending on the settings that you use. So stuff like directional animations is easy to do without any coding. In this case, in my project, I opted not to do it, but there's a lot of complexity there that you can utilize. And this is what you see in front of you is a fairly simple animation. There are also objects where that is definitely a lot more complicated. Let me see if I can find one like this one. Yeah, just a lot more stuff going on. Yeah, so anyway, this is the animator. It's really powerful. I like it a lot. I will get to your questions a little later, by the way, so just so you know. Okay, let's talk a little bit about physics. I already showed you a little bit. This player, for instance, it derives from the character body 2D, that derives from a collision object 2D. That itself is a node 2D, by the way. But there is physics in Godot built in. They built their own physics. My experience with it is that it's not extremely good, but it's good enough. And in most cases, it works really well. In some edge cases, it really breaks down. So that's something to look into. The physics system here works based on colliders and areas and static colliders. That's sort of, and of course, rigid bodies, kinematic rigid bodies or rigid bodies. And they built some custom things on top of it, such as the character body 2D, that adds some of the nice, easy things that you would want for every character in a game, for instance. In order to make our main player character walk, we just create this character body 2D, and we set its velocity and ask it to move and slide in this case, and it will handle everything else for us. So it was extremely easy to set this up initially, and so far I haven't really felt the need to add any more complexity to it. So yeah, that's really nice. There's actually a lot of features like that in Godot that are sort of built in already on top of the sort of the ground level of base functionality. And one of those other features is navigation. So when it comes to navigation, they have pathfinding and avoidance algorithms already built in that is really easy to just sort of throw into your project. And setting it up is extremely easy. You can have a navigation region that is automatically baked depending on collision. There is all sorts of tools that you can write that I also did that to help generate some of these things. So yeah, there's a lot of very easy to start stuff in here. And of course, I'm making a 2D game. I'm making a 2D game that's not grid-based. If you were to make this a grid-based game, you would also have a lot of very easy to use tile sets, tile maps with patterns that you can just copy-paste, drawing the patterns right here in the scene. So yeah, there's a lot of very simple, just out of the box tools in Godot. Let's talk a little bit about something that most games have, if not all games, which is UI. Yeah, of course, there's a lot of UI in this game as well. Good UI, as I said, they are control nodes. Control nodes are the things that have a couple of extra layout properties that make them well suited for responsive UI. Among them is anchoring. Among them is localization. That's also built in Godot, which is incredibly useful, and I also definitely use that system for my localization, including theming. And theming is something that is a little finicky. I personally find it's basically CSS, but not quite. For every object, you can determine styles, fonts, colors, etc. And then for every control, you can apply that theme to the control theme. And yeah, it's quite elaborate and it works really well. It's also very quick, a lot quicker than Unity. And one of the core features of control nodes is actually a child of control nodes called containers, which is equivalent to Unity's layout system, where all the positioning of elements is calculated based on the children that are part of that container. So they have many different types of containers. I've also myself built some of these containers. It works really well. Sometimes you end up with pretty deep nested structures to get the precise thing that you want. But yeah, I mean, that's also something that I also had to hack occasionally inside Unity. This control system, it's not exactly the same as Unity layout system, but it looks quite like it. It's very similar in terms of functionality. And one thing you can do in Unity is something you can also probably do in Godot. So yeah, I'm quickly moving on because time is passing real quick. We talked a little bit about navigation already. I showed you perhaps the audio tab already over here. So what we're looking at here is an audio bus. My sound designer he works himself in Godot as well. As you can see, he added a lot of effects here. You have audio buses, you can play different audio over these buses, have compressors, limiters, other effects. And what's really cool is that they recently also added sound and music players, so audio players that are interactive. So it makes stuff like synchronized tracks very easy, or it makes stuff like interactive music extremely easy. So yeah, audio, it has a lot of really fantastic tools, if I may say so. Yeah, in terms of like game making, there's a lot of stuff that I don't know. I don't have that much experience with, such as 3D, shaders, the C++ side of things, the performance compared to Unity, although I'm fairly certain that it depends, you know, and also multiplayer. I don't know too much about that inside Godot. But there's a couple things I did want to mention, exporting, plugins, tools, and how Godot is open source. So let's start with exporting. If you want to export to a platform, you go into this export window, and what you get here is a set of presets. So depending on the platform you want to export to, you can set up your presets differently, go export to different paths, different folders. So for instance, here I have no SDK and Steam demo. I will soon also add Steam main game as an export preset. And I find this to be extremely convenient and it works really well. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about this. There's just a big list of a bunch of settings, and exporting is really, really, really quick. I don't understand how that is the case, but I can show it to you here. That's it. It literally took a second to export the whole project to Linux. So yeah, I like it. It's great. There's of course one lingering question, the question that always everyone has, like how can you export to consoles? That's a little bit of a tricky question. Let me quickly switch over to this web page. There are multiple porting companies that essentially took the open source Godot engine and added proprietary SDK connecting code to it. And for a relatively small price compared to something like Unity, you can have access to those versions of Godot so that you can export to consoles. I haven't worked with this myself yet, I do plan to work with a company like W4 Games that is specifically also founded by the guy who came up with Godot. If that sounds fishy to you, it is not entirely. I can elaborate on that a little bit later. Yeah, that's the current status of exporting to consoles in Godot. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else I want to say about exporting right now. Let's talk a little bit about plugins. So plugins are, in a similar way, they work in a similar way as editor scripts in Unity. You can add plugins to your project, and it just works. You can add plugins to many things. I myself have added, for instance, Godot Steam as a plugin, which was literally a click of a button and tada, Steam integration works quite magically. I added some custom inspectors. I added this little run config tool that helps me, while developing the game, play different scenes and such. And I also wrote my custom translation file parser, because the automated translation system can scan scripts and scan scenes for strings that it wants to translate. And I wrote a custom parse for it. So yeah, everything you see in Godot, by the way, is built inside of Godot. So all the functionality you have inside the editor is also something that you can use in your game. And that's also why it is relatively easy. I say relatively because you still need to understand a lot of the systems, but it is relatively easy to slot in new editor tools or plugins into Godot, because the controls that you use, the types of UI elements that you use are the exact same for the editor already. So you can just slot it in there. Yeah. And then lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about the open source aspect of Godot, which is a very important aspect. So as you may know, you can see all the source code of Godot inside the GitHub of Godot, which is this Godot Engine /Godot on GitHub. And yeah, a lot of people submit issues. I also just submitted an issue that I found. A lot of people also submit pull requests, which is, if you have an addition or want to work on the documentation, or you want to fix some of the C++ code that's under the hood of the Godot engine, you can do that over here. And yeah, this system works incredibly well. And one very cool thing about this is that Godot also has this Godot proposals repository, where you can also add proposals to add new features or functionality to the engine, or change features or functionality. And the same people who contribute on the engine thoroughly read this list continuously as well. So what I've seen is that whenever I make an issue or whenever I make a proposal, it's always looked at by engine contributors. And sometimes my issues or my proposals are implemented the very same day, but just random people on the internet. It's incredible. I'm not used to this at all, but sometimes that happens to me. I don't have it here in front of me, but I recently made a little list of issues and proposals that I made that were implemented the very same day. That is very different from every piece of software I've ever used. Yeah, if you want to, you can also spend time actually compiling the game and the Godot engine on your computer and immediately get those fixes in. I personally don't do that, but it's all relatively easy, and it's very well documented. Documentation for Godot is absolutely fantastic. I've also personally contributed to it at least a dozen times by now. So that's also great. And just to give you a bit of an idea of how this works, because the Godot engine is an open source engine, but the way that it can still function is that it receives donations from many people, including myself. Here I am, tada. And that allows this foundation, the Godot Foundation, to manage the Godot project. And then the hope, I should say hope, because it's already slowly happening, but it's going to be happening more. That's at least what I think is going to happen, is that commercial game developers like myself have specific needs for the engine. For instance, I need it to run on Apple TV because I have a Apple Arcade deal. I hire a C++ programmer to port the engine also to Apple TV, and then how they call it, I push those changes upstream. So I push it to the open source again, make that part also open source so that everyone benefits. And using that idea that commercial devs have needs that can pay for it and then push it back to the open source community, that is very core to the way that Godot works. They recently also introduced this SDK list where people can submit these SDK integrations that work with Godot. And this list just started up, but it's going to be growing very soon, I think. So yeah, that's a very, very quick rundown of Godot. And now I will be looking at some of the questions that you guys had. Okay. So how do you bind the signals from other nodes that aren't in that node's hierarchy? It's a good question. There's one system I guess I haven't talked about so far, which is the globals system. So in Unity, you have this thing called persistent objects or persistent scripts or persistent something. In Godot, you have a very similar thing called globals. These are scenes or scripts, can be either, that also get loaded and they are also persistent. And so using this name, you can refer to them, but also you can apply a singleton pattern. Let's see if I can show that. I think, yeah, over here. You can load, for instance, this level resources thing through what they call an auto load, which is a global thing, a persistent object, and then instantiate this thing and set its instance to itself. So a singleton pattern, right? And so through a structure like that, you can register things in and out and find the objects that you need, and then sign up the signals. That's one way. Another way, if you want to connect something, is that if you want to connect a signal from a node that's to another node that's not in the same scene tree, of course, there's probably going to be a parent node. In my case, for instance, the level script instantiates a bunch of things, therefore has reference to those things. And once objects are loaded in, I could just set that all up. So yeah, hope that explains it at least a little bit. If you want to know a little bit more about singleton patterns and such, I could talk about that later. Okay, so yeah, there's a long question about GDScript versus C#. Would you say that we miss a lot if we went for C# instead of GDScript? So when I started in Godot myself the first time, I also started with C# because I felt comfortable with it. I found it a little annoying sometimes, especially when you look at stuff like the documentation. It is not fully translated, and occasionally I would run into these problems where engine native signals or names were written in snake case, which is the sort of default for GDScript, the default styling for GDScript. But in C# it works completely different. And so it's those kinds of little annoyances that you continue to run into. And then occasionally you will run into problems with the C# bindings to the Godot engine. They're continuously fixing those things, so it's not super bad. But yeah, I think it's at the end of the day a matter of preference. I think just for the sole reason of this in-editor script editor not being as fantastic as something like JetWriters or Visual Studio Code, a lot of developers coming from Unity will probably stick to C# just for that reason alone. I get that. The in-editor script, the text editor, is not as feature complete as Visual Studio Code or JetWriter. So yeah, I think One thing that you'll definitely miss is stuff like interfaces, something like namespaces, which doesn't exist in GDScript. Yeah, and then of course your secondary question is how mixable is it? I know some devs who mix GDScript and C#. In terms of performance, I know that regardless of whether you use GDScript or C#, if you use engine features, the performance is going to be the same. But if you do a lot of algorithm stuff, then it's likely that C# will be a little bit more performant because of the reason that it has just been more optimized for that. But yeah, I mean, this only really applies if you're going nuts over like performance stuff and you're doing millions of things at the same time. So that's at least a little bit my experience. Okay, I hope that answers your question a bit. Let's see what other questions you have. Is it possible to get a scene view of the game while it's playing? So yes, there's a bit of a yes and no answer to that. So right now here I have the game open. Let me actually make that really small. And I have the scene open, but it is not updated live. However, the scene tree is updated live, and so is the inspector and the debugger. So if I click on all these objects, I can see all the references, all the things that apply for the object I've selected in the remote scene tree, which is the scene tree of the game itself. Then I can also add at any moment, I can add a breakpoint, and it will just stop there. I can also actually go into the stack and actually watch it there. So I don't have the same exact way of looking at the scene live, but I do have a lot of other tools. That said, they just 3 or 4 days ago introduced a sort of live view for at least for 3D, maybe also for 2D, I don't know. That does allow you to essentially pause the game, and inside the view that you have inside the game, you can click on things that will then be selected also in the scene tree. So yeah, that is coming. This is a feature request that a lot of the Godot contributors know of and work towards. So yeah, that's something that's still coming. So there's a question about the audio. Do folks use something like Wwise or FMOD? You can use Wwise or Wwise or whatever it's called, and FMOD. I personally don't have experience to it. I also don't have a need for it because, as I said, the audio tools in Godot are already fantastic, like really good. So I don't know, but I know you can use it. I just don't have any experience with it. Yeah, there was a question about the differences between when I export a project. I made two presets, one no SDK and one with the SDK for Steam. So the difference here is that I set a bunch of custom features, I enable them. So every time this project is exported, I can check in my code whether this feature is enabled, and based on that, I can enable or disable parts of my code. I can also do the same thing for resources. So for instance, for the Mac no SDK version, I can simply not include the Godot Steam extension. So none of the DLLs or the Steam code actually makes it in. So that's one of the difference that you can make in these export presets, but there's more things. Yeah, and of course, like there's a lot of options that might differ. There's the folder that might differ, etc. So yeah, it can differ in various ways. That's at least how it works in Rift Riff in my project. Okay, good question. How's the input system? I totally glanced over that. The input system in Godot is very good, or at least very decent in my experience. You have input maps, which is something that you're probably familiar with. You define actions, you bind a bunch of buttons to those actions, and you can then use those actions in your code. That's all just built in. You also have a bunch of built-in actions that are already set up for you. And then, yeah, I mean, just like you would have in Rewired or Unity's new input system, you can just get the controllers, get the keyboard, switch, all sorts of funny stuff there. Works pretty well. I wrote my own input manager that uses a lot of that stuff already out of the box, but then adds a couple things like which input type is there currently being used. I also had to write some of my own code to then, for instance, have the right input maps or the images, the textures for the controller buttons to place those depending on the type of controller, etc. But yeah, generally speaking, it works well. I haven't run into anything yet. The only tricky thing I have run into is that inside UI, Godot assumes that you can only use one pointer. So if you want to make multi-input UI, which I don't think anyone ever wants to, but should you want to, things are going to get tricky. You probably have to build your own UI systems for that. So I would not recommend that. Other than that, yeah, touch works the same way as you would with handling pointers in other games, in other engines. So yeah, it's all there. Controller, keyboard, touch, pointers, input maps, etc. Yep. Let's see. Yeah, documentation, top tier, totally. Okay, so there's a good question. As someone who's predominantly an artist who happens to understand enough to code, how hard is it to contribute to the code base? Well, the code base is C++, which is really hardcore. And I won't lie, it's also huge. Like there are so many files in here and it is extremely complicated. I haven't really dived into any of the C++ stuff. I regularly do check some of the changes that happen, some of the things that get added. I'm almost, addicted to watching the PRs come in and see what gets merged and what not. But yeah, for me, C++ is hardcore and very much out of the question. The thing that I have contributed to is documentation. And yeah, that is fantastic. So last week, 4 days and 3 days ago, I decided to add some things or reword some things inside the documentation. And yeah, there's a lot of people that really care about it, including that people that actually wrote some of the features that I'm helping to document. And they will scrutinize away, and it's fantastic, honestly. And at the end of the day, I think you end up with a system that really truly allows the community to all to participate in other ways than just coding. So that be issues, documentation, translation, proposals, those kinds of things. And I think personally it's very important for professional game developers like ourselves to be involved with this, to make the proposals that for features that we need, that we think lack in Godot, because engine contributors really do look at them and really do consider them. Maybe not always perhaps individually, but they do have a good sense of the features that most people want and the features that professional game developers need. I am sometimes also speaking with some people from the Godot Foundation. As a professional game developer, I think it's important to keep that relationship warm because with those people, of course, you can help nudge the engine into the direction that I think is going to be important for professional game developers. Yeah, so that about contributing. Any special considerations when it comes to source control? Not much, although I must say it can occasionally be a little bit finicky. So I personally use Git. Let me actually bring this up. I use Git with Godot, and yeah, it works really well. Also in a team structure, and all this like stuff like scenes are all text files, so you can check out everything that happens in a text format. And the only worry I have sometimes is that the caching of Godot can sometimes, or the order in which things are cached, can sometimes mess things up. So I will find myself regularly go to project and click reload current project, which goes really quickly. I'll just demonstrate here right now. Boop, boop, boop. That's it. Okay, we're back. Oh yeah, sorry, I need to make the window size good again. So I do find myself after most Git operations, just to be safe, do this process that I just showed you. But sometimes when something breaks, the nice thing is that you can go into any code editor, such as Visual Studio Code, and open up the whole Godot project. And you'll find that all the assets, most of the assets are just text-based, so you can search and replace in case there's a reference that has gone bad, or a dependency that has gone wrong, a rename, or whatever that's gone bad. There's always a relatively easy way to fix it if you open up a code editor and open the entire Godot project, because most of the resources are text resources. So yeah, that about that. Does GDScript have something called coroutines? Yes, it has the await function, the await keyword, I guess. Is that what it is? And await essentially means wait for this thing. You can await a signal as well, which is really fancy. Every function can become a signal. And then you can await a function. You can go batshit insane on that. Really fun sometimes. Okay, another question. Are there any things you miss from Unity that Godot doesn't have or doesn't do as well? Yeah, I think at the end of the day, Godot and Unity are just very different kinds of engines that do things also very differently. And of course, I transitioned fully to GDScript. And sometimes I do miss like something like a Visual Studio Code, like an editor like that. But other than that, it's just more of the same, just slightly different. Yeah, I don't know. So I don't know, not necessarily. Okay, how is data compatibility over different versions of Godot? Are there a lot of deprecated things? So the current approach of Godot is that they're going to see how long they can stick to the major versions. So right now we're in Godot 4.3. That's the latest stable. And the compatibility between minor versions, so say 4.1 to 4.2 or 4.2 to 4.3, they have really excellent compatibility guides. Yeah, I'm not going to look that up now, but bottom line is it's really well doable. It's really doable to transition from one minor version to the other. Major versions are probably a little harder, but it really depends on the changes they make. And so far, right now, they do not have any Godot 5.0 planned. They are only planning for minor versions right now. And minor versions come with big features as well. So that's their current approach. At least that's the recent thing I heard from them. There are constantly things being deprecated, such as, for instance, parallaxing. There was a specific parallax node that helped you set up some 2D parallaxing. They completely wrote a new system for 4.0, and it was completely replaced in 4.2. And then the old node becomes deprecated, and probably in like, I don't know, 4.5 or something, it gets kicked out. So yeah. That about compatibility and deprecation. Let's see, is there any dynamic music editor or tools in Engine? Yes. Like I said, when it comes to audio, there are some really cool things that I personally have not used myself. I think it's an audio stream player where you can select a stream that can be all sorts of things, and you can go really wild in this. So you can have an audio stream playlist, audio stream interactive, just a simple audio stream, which is just play something. And yeah, these things, they get really crazy. I don't even know how this precisely works. Other than that, it has a lot of really solid tools for audio. So yeah, if you're interested in interactive music, definitely look into those kinds of things. Is there any features I'm missing in Godot so far? No. I mean, there's some plugins that I miss. There's some SDKs that still need to be implemented, but that's growing extremely quickly. As I was showing this list, this is a list of stuff that's currently there already in one form or another. I know that the Godot and the Godot Foundation are in talks with parties like Apple, Epic, and also Console, and also other platforms to make sure that their plugins also support Godot. So I think if it's not already there, either someone has wrote it and wrote their own plugin, and you can find it on GitHub, or it's going to come soon. Yeah. Let's see. Is there a concern because it's open source that it's going to get bigger and bigger and bloat, slowing it down and making it hard to use? Or that it might diverge in different paths and end up having a lot of different branches that don't necessarily have similar features? Yeah, that's a little hard to say. It is a big question. My personal experience is that the engine contributors, they do look a lot at the proposals and they have a lot of considerations. So if we as professional game developers make those proposals and be heard, so to speak, that's, I think, the best way that developers like us can make sure that this engine is going to remain to be an engine that's useful for game developers. So that's one part of it. The other part is that I think it's very smart to stay in touch with the people from the Godot Foundation, because those are the people that organize it and then make some of the larger decisions to be made when it comes to direction of the engine. So yeah, I think those two things are very relevant. I know of some forks of Godot that for instance, there's a fork of Godot that runs the Godot engine completely inside Swift, and there's another that runs it that adds Rust, like another programming language, to it. And there's also some forks of Godot that just have a lot of other utilities to them added. So you get a small community of people that specifically use that fork, but I think the majority of the people still come to the main Godot repository to contribute here and to make proposals and issues here. So I don't know. So far, most people just flock to the main version. So we'll see what happens in the future. Okay, then there's some talk about awaits. VR support is, I believe, very good. I know that I see this guy in the PRs, and because I'm keeping track of it so closely, there's this guy, what's this called? Bastiaan, here, this guy, Bastiaan Olij. He is really on top of it. Anytime there is some update to any SDK, he is there and he implements all the features. So yeah, Godot and VR are hand in hand. So I think support is really fantastic. And if there's features missing, you just talk to this guy, I believe, and he will fix it for you. So that's my experience there. Okay, another question. How many of the different types of assets in the engine can be saved with plain text so you can easily diff, etc.? So I talked, of course, earlier about resources. So I also use resources and custom resources extensively. And let me show you one example. So we have the level, right? This level that we were looking at earlier. Here's a waves file. This is a custom resource of type wave data that I wrote on top of resource that has a bunch of the waves for this particular level saved. And this is a text file. Let me open it up for you in in whatever, I don't know, sure. Some text editor. This is how all the resources look. You have to learn a little bit how to read these kinds of files, and it's not always ideal, especially with the scene files, because there's just a lot of stuff that goes on. But generally speaking, it keeps a list of external resources and then just the particular resources as separate objects. Very readable, very easy to merge if necessary. And yeah, my experience with this is that I have learned to read these files quite well. And yeah, it just works well. I don't know what else to say about it. Yeah, sure. So someone was asking, can you see how wave data is defined? Let's do that. So is there an easy way for me to do this? Yes. Let's show this here. Yeah, okay, so wave data extends from resource. It itself has a build resource at start. Then it has an array of waves. Then we can go into waves. Yeah, I need to click this. So normally I don't have this. Normally I split this and I put this on the side, but I don't have that now. Okay, so if you go into waves, the wave has a duration property and again an array, so essentially it's a nested object. And then we can go into the spawn. Let's go inside the spawn. That looks really ugly. Has a bunch of more simple exports, among them position, some integers, floats, a custom enumerator, etc. And then that is here at the bottom. That looks like this. So that's the data structure. That is just one example. As you can see, nested resources, all that kind of stuff works basically out of the box. I'm not a huge fan of this inspector myself, but there is one or two proposals that are going to make this thing a little bit more compact and a little bit more clear in how it works. But until that time, this works fine for me. Yeah, initially I was very reluctant to use this inspector, but now I'm just totally fine with it. Have you needed to create many or any custom tools for your project, or have the existing nodes / plugins been enough for you? I have built a bunch of tools, among them, like I said, so the wave data inspector. The thing that we're watching now, there's this label here that says 16 Basecamp juice gen, and then a bunch of other numbers. That's a label I added, like a custom inspector, so to speak. And the same goes for inside the spawn thing. There's also a label there with duration, all sorts of things. So that's a small tool I built. Another tool I built was to translate, to have a parser for the files. So one thing I guess I didn't show you is that built in, there's localization tools. One of them is something called POT generation. That's a POT file is some system called getText, stuff you can forget very quickly. But basically I can add all the files that contain strings or contain keys that need to be translated. And I can just generate one of those files like this, bada bee, bada boom. And then I can open a translation file editor because it's a custom kind of file type. And you can add the translations to those files. And to parse the scripts and scenes, I wrote a little, I keep doing this. I wrote a little script that also adds some custom translation stuff, in this case for controller, keyboard and touch into the keys. Anyway, yeah, very specific. But you asked about whether I made tools. This is one of them. Most of the tools, if you make them, they go into this add-ons, plugins thing. So there's not really much of a difference between plugins that you wrote and plugins that other people wrote, because you have the source code for both most of the time. Yeah, is there other tools I wrote? Yeah, I wrote one thing for the levels that based on the navigation region together with the ground, I generate the collider of a level. And then based on that, I can also generate the nav mesh automatically. It was relatively easy to write this script. It's this script. It's not that many lines of code, not even 50. And it was very easy, to be honest. So yeah, these are just 3 examples of tools that I built. So one in the editor, one is sort of in the background, and one in the scene. Just to give you a bit of an idea. Okay, is each wave a separate file on disk or stored within wave data? It's stored within wave data in this particular case. So this one file contains resources and sub-resources and sub-resources. Yeah. Okay. Ugly nesting is definitely a problem. I agree. Okay, what are my biggest gripes with the engine so far? Well, one of the gripes I have is that I think the profile, I miss the Unity deep profiler a little bit. So in Unity, you could really go super deep into the profiler. Let's see how deep we can go here. It just doesn't work. Oh yeah, I put a breakpoint somewhere. There we go. Let's start. It just doesn't go as deep. And that's certainly something that I miss. Yeah, no, where do I go? Yeah, okay, so here's all the script functions. Yeah, I don't know. It's not as good as the one that Unity has. And of course, you can still look at the actual like milliseconds it took for each sort of category. But yeah, I don't know. I like it. I liked the one in Unity more. There is call stacks, stack trace or whatever. You just need to break somewhere. For instance, here I need to. Oh, it's already paused. And then, yeah, no, maybe not the same. You're right. Yeah, I don't know. I don't open this. I don't open this right now too often because I don't like it that much. There's more here. What is this? Breakpoints. Okay. Any other questions? Any other gripes I have with the engine? Yeah, there's a question about memory management. Is there a garbage collector in GDScript? There is not. It uses a different concept. I did look into it once. I just don't know enough about the details of memory management in C++ to actually tell you something useful. I believe, no, I don't remember. I cannot give you the right words for it. It's something that you can certainly look up. What's the best way to look that up? There's this guy called Yuan Linitsky, Reduzio on Twitter at least, and he talks a lot about core concepts in Godot, and also talks about engine architecture. He has a bunch of videos also explaining some of the engine architecture. Yeah, you should look this guy up. He's one of the original creators of Godot. So he knows what he's talking about, and fairly certain he recently shared a video on this. Yeah, so I think this is it, right? No, this is compute shaders. Anyway, look it up. I'm sure you'll be able to find it. He has videos on that kind of stuff. Yeah. Okay, yeah, there's a good question here about Godot and string dependency. And I skipped a question. I'll come back to that. There's a lot of string constants. Yes. In GDScript, you have this thing called a string name, which is the equivalent of a C# string literal, I believe. I'm not sure. I think so. And GDScript uses those a lot for connecting, for instance, an input map, the name of an input map to the code in your input, or in other places, it uses the animation names also as string names. And so I've personally gotten into the habit of also using string names, which in the case of code, you write with an ampersand in front of the string. So it turns that string into a string name. String name is just like, I believe, C# literals, is extremely quick to compare to, because it's, I believe it has to do something with hashing. Like you compare the hash of the string name as opposed to the actual characters inside the string itself. So it's mostly a performance thing also. But yeah, at the same time, you're right. You don't have to use it everywhere, though. It's just some places, and I have not necessarily run into a lot of troubles where I'm mistyping something or something like that. And of course, you can always still use enumerators, which autocomplete and work just fine. Very similar to in C, how they work in C#. So yeah, it's not necessarily string dependent. It does use strings quite a lot, in the same way that it uses signals quite a lot. All things that you don't necessarily have to use in that regard, but yeah, I think it's just too common, not very bad. Any downsides to hot reloading? Yeah, I mean, sometimes some resources that are already loaded will not always reload, like it tries to cache them, and it decides for a lot of the built-in resources, such as a packed scene or a texture, it has already made the decisions about whether it needs to keep those in cache when you hot reload, or whether it can just, or whether it actually has to reload the file that you just resaved. So it's a little bit hit or miss whether the thing that you're adjusting will actually update during hot reloading. So yeah, that is my experience with it. In my experience, when I actually use this feature, I rarely run into this, and I still very often, because the way how I develop my game, I just hit this restart button or stop and play, because I need to go back a wave, for instance, or I build something. Oh damn, player's still fucking fast. So yeah, I don't know if there's any downsides to the hot reloading. I guess not, but that's at least some of the nuance to hot reloading. Yeah, I think those are the questions for now. We can just also open up the microphones for other people now. I will stop recording. Thanks everyone for asking your questions, and yeah, let's continue doing some discussion if we want. Good. Good to hear.